Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, and I'm very excited to welcome you today to the first of what will be a weekly webcast to bring to you a full picture of the strategic situation, as well as what can be done to ensure that the situation moves in the right direction. The world is a very dangerous place right now, as most of you know, and I'm sure you also are aware of the fact that you cannot trust most of what you read in the mainstream media or see on television. The speaker today and for the next weeks ahead is Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, who's the founder of the Schiller Institute and the chairman of the Schiller Institute, who's been at the center of introducing a new dynamic, which is known as the New Silk Road or the Belt and Road Initiative. She's played a role internationally in bringing this to the fore, in spite of the fact that there has been an almost total blackout of the developments that are quite significant in shaping all of our future. And so we're going to hear now from Mrs. LaRouche, who will bring us up to date on the developments around the New Silk Road and also the strategic situation. Helga?
Yes, hello. Well, we are at a crossroad of human history, much more so than most people are aware of, because you have right now two totally opposite dynamics in the world. One is that what we know from the United States and European nations, that you have a collapsing paradigm. You have a society which is clearly not functioning, which is reflected in many symptoms like the Brexit, like the election loss of Hillary Clinton, like the recent vote in Italy against the change of the constitution, the German election, which is dramatic, and now the Catalonia referendum. These are all symptoms that something is fundamentally wrong. And it is the fact that the efforts by the neocons to establish an unipolar world after the collapse of the Soviet Union went along with neoliberal policies which have shattered the livelihood of many millions of people, and there is a revolt against this very system going on right now. If you look at all of these different cases I just mentioned, they have one thing in common, and that is that the gap between rich and poor is widening such that those people who are not profiting from this neoliberal paradigm, they somehow don't see a future anymore. They feel despair. They don't feel represented through the establishments of their respective countries. So this part of the world is in a deeply troubled situation. But what you have on the other side is that there is a growing number of nations which are working together with China on the New Silk Road. Now, the New Silk Road is a very exciting perspective. I mean, most people know that the ancient Silk Road, which existed 2,000 years ago during the Han Dynasty, brought an enormous development to people of all countries who participated in this ancient Silk Road. Not only porcelain and silk and book printing, but technologies enabling a higher productivity of the populations of these countries. Now, 4 years ago, President Xi Jinping of China announced that the policy of China heretofore would be the establishment of a new Silk Road. Now, in the 4 years which have passed since that time, more than 110 nations are collaborating in one form or another with this concept. It has led to an enormous explosion of productivity, of development. China, which has developed in the last 30 years in particular, with something of the Chinese economic miracle, which is the most impressive economic miracle which ever happened in history. And China, with the New Silk Road, has offered that kind of development to all other nations. So, this is a completely changed situation because for the first time, developing countries in particular have access to credit. China and the BRICS countries, which work closely with the New Silk Road conception, have established a whole bunch of different credit institutions, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the New Development Bank, the New Silk Road Fund, the Maritime Silk Road Fund, and many others. And they have now given credits for concrete development projects for Latin American countries, for Asian countries, even for some European countries, and also especially for Africa. So as a result of that, you have right now a completely new spirit. It's called the New Silk Road spirit. It's the idea that nations for the first time have the hope to overcome underdevelopment, to overcome poverty. China is committed to alleviate all of poverty in China until the year 2020. And China already now has less poor people than the United States, namely 42 million and 43 million officially in the United States. Now, China is also committed to eliminate poverty on a global scale in collaboration with the other developing countries. Now, this is a very exciting perspective. And what we are trying to do with the activities of the Schiller Institute, we are trying to tell people about this alternative. And it is our explicit aim to win over even the United States, to work with China, with Russia, with India, with other leading countries of the so-called developing sector, to establish a completely new paradigm as it was proposed by Xi Jinping, where countries would stop to have geopolitical confrontations and work together in a win-win perspective. So this is happening, and obviously the people who are representing the old paradigm, the neocons, the neoliberals, they are absolutely freaked out about the success of the New Silk Road, and they are right now in the process of launching one attack after the other, accusing China that they would just do the same thing what Anglo-American imperialism or other colonialisms did before. But what we want to do with this program, we want to go into the depths of what's happening, and as the weeks go along, we want to explain why what is happening with the New Silk Road is really a completely new model of international relations, and it is not a repetition of what was in the past. So therefore, I'm very happy to have this discussion, and you should also send in questions and participate in this discussion and help to spread the news everywhere.
Now, Helga, you attended the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, where I think over 100 nations were there. Just describe a little bit the sense of optimism that you experienced there.
Well, I was privileged to be one of probably 2,000 delegates from 110 countries. And there were 29 leaders speaking. First, naturally, President Xi Jinping, then President Putin, Erdogan, Guterres, the General Secretary from the United Nations, and many others. And listening to these people, it was really clear to many delegates I spoke with afterwards that we were participating in the formation of a new world economic order and actually the beginning of a new era of civilization. I mean, in a certain sense, people know that, if you stick to geopolitics, if you stick to the idea that one nation has the right to fight for its interest against another nation, even in the worst case with military means, or a group of nations defending their so-called geopolitical interest against another group of nations, or trying to maintain an unipolar world, that in the time of thermonuclear weapons, this would potentially lead to the destruction of civilization. And therefore, people participating in this summit was not just the idea that it will bring economic benefits to all countries participating, but that a new form of thinking about mankind first and then national interest is absolutely necessary. And President Xi Jinping has expressed that many times by saying, we are a community of a shared future, of a shared destiny of mankind. And I think the new paradigm is really, to start to understand what this new paradigm has to be, is we have to concentrate first on the common aims of mankind, such as earthquake prediction, which, the case of Mexico underlines again why this is absolutely crucial. Overcoming poverty, developing energy and raw material security, developing joint space research and travel. There are so many exciting tasks which will, in the final analysis, determine if our human species will be successful and maintain its condition of life for the indefinite future. And that is what is the new paradigm, that we must grow up as a human species, that we absolutely have to stop to have wars. We cannot have war as conflict resolution in a time of thermonuclear weapons. And what was the spirit of the new Silk Road, which was very much present at this Belt and Road Forum in May in Beijing, was exactly that. So it was a very, very incredible experience. And I think all the people who participated in it, almost nobody did not have that view. There were a few exceptions, like the EU. They said, no, we determine the rules. But that was a minority, and most people from most countries were extremely excited that now an alternative to a collapsing system does exist.
The United States was represented there by Matthew Pottinger, who was sent by President Trump. What's your view of Trump's relationship with this new paradigm and his relationship with Xi Jinping? Is the United States about to join this, or can the US be brought into this?
Well, President Trump, during his election campaign, was quite famous for China bashing. But somehow this President Trump is not what the Western media describe him to be. As a matter of fact, all the people who met with him and who have somehow communicated that with me or with other people from the Schiller Institute have confirmed that he is actually quite capable to judge the situation on his own, and he is absolutely determined to do the right thing for the American people. And fortunately, when he met President Xi Jinping for the first time in April in Mar-a-Lago, the two presidents hit it off really well, and a very positive chemistry between them developed. So China has offered to the United States to join the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Schiller Institute has campaigned already since 2015 for very explicitly why China should invest in infrastructure development in the United States. China has $1.4 trillion worth of US treasuries, which could be brought to a very productive use if China would be allowed to invest in the absolute urgent infrastructure requirements in the United States. And on the other side, American firms could invest in the many projects along the Belt and Road, projects along the new Maritime Silk Road and the new Silk Road. So a very positive perspective exists between the two countries. And I'm quite optimistic that when President Trump goes to a state visit in November this year in the context of a larger Asia trip, there is a good perspective that this will come up and some more formal arrangements could be made between the United States and China. I think the improvement of these two nations, which are the two largest economies in the world, if they can find a way to work together, I'm absolutely certain then also the relationship with the United States and Russia can be brought in order. And if the three largest and most important nations of the world, the United States, China, and Russia, can find a way to cooperate, who could be against that and who would want to be against it? I think that that is within reach, and all people who love peace should help to bring the knowledge about this new Silk Road conception, because that is the only workable perspective for this to happen.
Well, we're told daily in the transatlantic media that the issue of so-called Russiagate is Russian meddling in the US elections, and Trump collusion with Putin. But you've said that it much more has to do with what you just were discussing, the potential for the United States to break out of the old geopolitical paradigm, the unipolar world. How do you see this thing developing now?
Well, Russiagate is sort of, out of the window since the VIPs, the Veterans for Sanity and Intelligence, this former intelligence officials of the United States have proven that there was no Russia hacking. The whole reason for Russiagate and other scandalizing of President Trump is exactly that. I mean, he represents the potential of improving the relationships with both with Russia and China. And from the standpoint of the old empire, what we generally call the British Empire, even it's not the British people, it's more the unipolar world faction which emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They are horrified about that because the whole game plan of the British Empire, with the specification that it's not the British people, but this construct of central banks, of investment banks, of hedge funds, of insurance companies, the whole financial structure which has emerged basically in the transatlantic world. Their whole game was always to manipulate, divide and conquer, to play one against the other, to create wars. And if you look at the efforts with which the unipolar faction, which as we have now found out is not identical with the US president, but it exists in Great Britain, it exists in other parts of Europe. The way they have tried to impose an unipolar world in the post-war period was through policies of regime change, color revolution, or even wars based on lies, as we have seen in the Middle East. That whole policy, is about to be taken over by this new dynamic I just described. And, they are frantically trying to prevent Trump from working with China and the United States. And right now, there is a huge campaign of anti-Chinese propaganda. The Economist, in the last week of September, had on their cover story a mean-looking panda bear saying, China has basically plans to take over the world. Then you had other reports, Fox TV, basically describing quite a certain woman called, I think, Anna Pierce from the Churchill Society, describing quite well what China is doing, all this infrastructure, railroad building and so on, and saying the outrageous thing is even the Confucius Institutes are trying to portray a positive image about Chinese culture. Can you imagine such a thing? Anyway, so they're in a rampage trying to poison the minds of people against this perspective, especially because the possibility that President Trump would go in this direction is extremely high. So, I'm optimistic that the new Silk Road dynamic cannot be stopped. It is moving in Africa. We should talk about that separately. It is, even Eastern Europe, Central Europe, the Balkan countries, the Southern European states, they all are getting on board. Switzerland, Austria, they all want to be hubs of the new Silk Road. So I don't think this dynamic can be stopped, except, there is the danger still of conflict creation, manipulation and so forth. But I think, the good people of this world would want nothing better than to move the world into a more safe plane on a higher level of reason, where people and nations can work together for the common good of all.
Well, and Helga, I think one of the other things that most people don't realize is that those who have been calling the shots, the unipolar people, the regime changers and others, are very weak right now because of the collapsing financial system. And something that was said by President Trump just in the last 36 hours probably sent tremors through Wall Street when he said that Puerto Rico should just wipe out its debt. Talk a little bit about this financial crisis, because this underlies the whole danger to the transatlantic elites and also is partly opening the door for this new paradigm?
Well, if you really look at the economic parameters of Europe and the United States, you can see that the transatlantic financial system is collapsing. I mean, the growth rates in China have been, for the last 5 years, 7.2% or so average. Before it was even higher. In the global economy, it was average 2.5. But in the United States and in Europe, there was stagnation or even downward development, like the life expectancy in the United States is going down. If you ever have seen an economic parameter which tells you what is the directionality, it is the fact that people have a shorter life. Now, there are absolutely many warnings by many people, even the Adam Smith Institute in London or the former economic minister of Italy, Tremonti, who are all agreeing with us that the next financial blowout is just a matter of a very short period of time, basically because the central banks have done absolutely nothing to remedy the causes which led to the 2007-2008 crisis. The quantitative easing, which the EZB just announced they want to continue for the next several years, what that did is they put out a lot of liquidity, which increased the debt of states, the debt of firms, the debt of car buyers. And now you have a situation where if you move away from the zero or even negative interest rate policy, you risk a collapse of many firms. Even the IMF said if you only go up a little bit with the interest rate, 20% of all corporations in the United States would collapse. You have an Italian banking crisis. You have a terrible situation in all of Europe as a result of the fact that the privileges of the speculators were strengthened and the austerity programs hit the poorer parts of the population, which has led to an absolutely catastrophic situation. And such things as the Brexit, or now the German election result, where a right-wing party with some really very ominous and dangerous racist elements within its leadership has won the third largest position. And in the East, new states, it has become the second strongest party, and in Saxony, even the strongest party. So these are all results of these policies. And the remedy is obviously you have to do exactly what Franklin D. Roosevelt did in the 30s. And when President Trump now announced that he wants to cancel the debt of Puerto Rico, which is $72 billion, this is absolutely a step in the right direction to do then, the full program, what Roosevelt did in the 30s, Glass-Steagall separation, a new financial system like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the New Deal, and then you naturally have to apply the full package of what the American economist Lyndon LaRouche, my husband, has prescribed for several years now. You need a full reorganization of the American economy and actually the global economy, Glass-Steagall, a new credit system, and then you have to have a crash program to increase the productivity of the economy. China is doing that already, but the transatlantic world urgently needs to do these kinds of reforms if we are supposed to survive this present situation.
Well, in talking about the crisis and the dynamic for change, one of the things that's obvious is that across all of the West, there's an anger at the elites, anger at the political parties. And that's what you have referenced was the case in Germany. And now we have this somewhat strange case of the separate referendum in Catalonia. Is this part of the same dynamic of the rejection of the existing establishment?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, you can say that the Catalonia vote is a result of the austerity policy which was imposed on Spain. First, Spain actually was hit by the financial crisis of 2008. but then especially the austerity policy of the Troika, of the EZB, the European Commission, and the IMF, which has increased the unemployment that, despite little improvements, is still 18% average, almost 50 or 60% youth unemployment. And these figures are not even the correct ones, because you had an enormous brain drain of young people and skilled labor leaving Spain, so that the actual unemployment, if you would count the people who left the country, would be included, is even much higher. So that same condition exists in Greece, in Portugal, in Italy. And let me just spend one more word on the German situation, because this election, which brought the worst result for the CDU-CSU party of Merkel since the Second World War, and the worst result for the social democracy since Bismarck. I mean, that is really an earthquake. But what is even more incredible is that you have a complete divide between the east and west of Germany, because in the east, the vote for this so-called alternative for Germany was so large, not just because it was triggered by the refugee crisis, which obviously was a factor, but the reason why people reacted so absolutely strongly is because they got devastated with the unification. Sure, you have beautiful marketplaces, restored houses, historic buildings, but behind this facade, you have depopulation. The women left to the west, the young people left. You have villages which are either completely depopulated or only of pensioners. There is no economic hope in many regions of Eastern Germany. And it was that feeling of having been completely deprived of their life work, which was the neoliberal system which was imposed on them, which was the reason why people reacted so strongly on this refugee question. What I'm trying to explain to an international audience is that Germany, which used to be looked at as the anchor of stability of the European Union, is now in a real process of chaos, and they may not even be able to form a new government, because the only available coalition, given the fact that the Social Democrats don't want to be part of a grand coalition anymore, would be of those parties which only won in the West, but are not, or only very little represented in the East. So Germany is in a real chaotic situation. And this I have said many times. The phenomena like the Brexit, the election loss of Hillary Clinton, the no to the referendum in Italy, the German election, and now the Catalonia referendum. All of these things are symptoms of the same injustice, and people are reacting to this injustice, and this will continue until the causes of this injustice are removed. And the only way to remove them is you have to take on and up the offer of China to join the new Silk Road. I mean, Europe needs reconstruction as much as the United States, and we have to join hands to build up the economies of the Middle East, countries which have been completely destroyed by war. And we have to obviously develop Africa, which China is doing in an unbelievable way, but we must get the United States and European nations to join hands, and then we can remedy all problems. So people should really understand that we have to get over geopolitics. If you want to solve any problem, the new Silk Road is the way to approach it.
I think just one other thing I'd like to bring up for this program, you've brought up Africa a couple of times, and the Schiller Institute has played a leading role for 30 years in promoting a program that has to do with the shrinkage of Lake Chad. And there's been some positive developments on that. Can you say something about that?
Well, more generally, Africa has been in a condition which is really incredible. I mean, there is no reason why there should be poverty in Africa. but for colonialism and then the IMF conditionalities, which deliberately kept Africa down. I mean, if you look at John Perkins's book, The Economic Hitman, which is very useful to read in this context, there was no intention to develop Africa until China started to invest. Now, China has, for the last several years, built several incredible projects. A railroad from Djibouti to Addis Abeba, 750 kilometers. It is now building railroads from Kenya all the way to Rwanda, Uganda, and Mozambique. It has built already industrial parks, hydropower, dams, and now this project of the Transaqua, this is something we discovered, I think, in the late 80s or beginning of the 90s in our efforts to develop development plans for Africa. It's the idea that given the fact that Lake Chad is drying out, it has less than 10% of its original volume of water. And naturally, this affects 30 million people in the entire region. So there is this Italian firm, Bonifica, and Marcello Vicchi, who was a very good engineer. He developed, together with some colleagues, already end of the 70s, the idea that you can take some of the surplus water of the tributaries of the Congo River, 3% or so, and this has no negative effect at all because it's water which goes into the ocean unused. You would bring this water from these tributaries in 500 kilometers height through a system of canals and rivers integrated with canals all the way to Lake Chad, and you would refill the Lake Chad, but in addition you would develop an inland shipping system which would benefit 12 nations. You would have large amounts of water for irrigation of agriculture. You would have hydropower for all the participating nations. So this is really a game changer for the entire African continent. And there is right now an agreement to do a feasibility study between the Chinese and the Italian government. And recently, some Chinese publications gave the Schiller Institute credit that we promoted this project and we brought these connections about. And the same is true what we are in the present period succeeding to get the Kra Canal in Thailand on the agenda, to get the reconstruction of Syria on the agenda. So all of these things are live actions, but I can assure you that because of what China has been doing in Africa, the spirit of the Africans has completely changed. They no longer want to be treated as people you can make sermons to about good governance and human rights and democracy, but they now demand that anybody who talks to them should talk to them as equal partners, should make direct investments in cooperation with the governments. And there is a completely new spirit. I mean, it should not be that large parts of the world should live in these unbelievable conditions of poverty. It's not a natural condition of mankind. And this is now changing. People are optimistic, and the possibility that the African continent in a few years can be completely free of hunger and poverty is absolutely on the agenda. And I think this alone, I mean, think about all the Afro-Americans in the United States. They should get excited about that, because I know that there is not so much focus on their side on Africa as it should be. But I think this is a very, very good opportunity that Afro-Americans should get on board and fight for the implementation of the new Silk Road, not only for the United States, but get the United States to join hands with Africa to develop Africa.
Well, Helga, as we talked about in setting up this weekly webcast, we wanted to bring the spirit of the New Silk Road, as you called it, to the broadest audience possible. And I think this discussion you just had at the end on Africa is precisely that, how this spirit can give people a sense of confidence in the ability to break the stranglehold of geopolitics on the world and bring us to this new economic paradigm. So I want to encourage our listeners to engage your friends, your colleagues, and others to discuss the ideas that are being presented here. And let's use this opportunity, which may be our last opportunity, to break this power of this oligarchy and to bring the whole world into this new economic paradigm. And Helga, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we'll be back next week.
Yes, bye-bye.